So, the last time we met, we talked about the lead up to establishing the Constitution of the United States. And we talked about the two plans that were presented at the convention. We talked about the Virginia plan, which presented the idea of creating a two-house legislature, which would have a lower house elected by the people, an upper house with delegates from elected by the lower house, and an executive branch, a national judiciary. And this plan was rejected because critics were worried that it gave large states a lot of influence and power because of proportional representation, which we talked about in class. And then, of course, overall, it would give the federal government too much power. And then there was the New Jersey plan, which essentially reestablished everything that the Articles of Confederation proposed, which was a one house legislature with equal representation, and Congress would have the right to tax and regulate commerce. And the problem with this is it only addressed the problems of the Articles of Confederation. It's not really dealing with those long term issues of slavery versus free states, political idealism versus political reality, structure and representation of this new kind of government. So when we ended our last meeting, we ended with the Great Compromise, otherwise known as the Connecticut Plan. So, picking up from there, I want to talk about what this Connecticut Plan ultimately looks like. When we talk about the compromise here, this compromise establishes the two house legislature. And that is going to have a lower house and an upper house. The lower house is going to look like what is originally proposed in the Virginia plan, where you are going to have a house that's elected directly by the people. And the size of the lower house is determined by the population size. So this is essentially going to be the House of Representatives, right? And this is going to be a little bit like proportional representation in the sense that you are going to have larger states. Depending on your population size, larger states are going to be the most benefited by the House of Representatives. So places like Virginia and New York, and even Pennsylvania, these states are going to benefit more than places like, um, you know, uh, smaller states along the coast like Delaware. Delaware is going to be um, sort of lost in the crowd among the voices of these larger represented states. Um, but then there's the upper house, and the upper house would have two representatives, regardless of the population size. And these representatives would be elected by state legislatures. So, state legislators would decide who would represent each state. So it's not decided by the House of Representatives or anyone else. It would be decided within the state itself. And here's why that's important. And it's important in your notes to take notice of that. So I'm going to make sure to highlight that as well. Because when we talk about state legislatures here, it's important that that's emphasized because they wanted to make sure that states felt like they had a say and they had a little bit of influence at the federal level. So now you've got representation among the people in the lower house with the House of Representatives, but in the upper house, which of course would become what we know now as the Senate. And the Senate, of course, has the most power, the most influence. You have a voice from the state governments, right? So whether we're talking about the state of Virginia or the state of New York or the state of Georgia, those state legislatures are the ones who are deciding who their senators are going to be, and that's pretty significant. So when we talk about um, how this is all going to continue in terms of the federal government, the Great Compromise also establishes an executive branch. The executive would be elected by what they establish as the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is important because it's going to be, and we're going to talk about the Electoral College in more detail later on, but the Electoral College is very complicated. But one of the things, I'm going to go back for a second, the Electoral College is important because the Electoral College is also going to involve the states. It's the electors are going to be determined by the state legislatures as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, we're going to talk about them later on in the semester, but the Electoral College is incredibly complicated. And there are arguments back and forth about whether or not to continue it and that sort of thing. But it's another way for the state legislatures to stay involved at the federal level. So when we talk about how this compromise continues to work, and again, um, these were the two big questions about whether or not there should be what the legislature should look like and the executive branch should look like. Um, this plan is really what gets the most support. The question is, okay, how are we going to determine representation among the states, right? How is that going to work? Because um, we have to figure out how many people live in each state, and then we can decide on what Congress is going to look like, right? So typically, to determine the population size, you have to conduct a census. A census is not a new concept. Taking a census is something that has been happening throughout civilizations for hundreds and hundreds of years, going back to um, ancient civilizations. So they decide or make the decision to take a census in 1790. And then they make it a law to take a census every 10 years after that. Um, here's the issue that comes up. Southerners want to count the enslaved as a part of their population. Um, and this is going to be a problem for the Northerners because Northerners are going to make the argument, and this is a perfectly valid and absolutely correct argument. Uh, and Northerners argue, listen, you are wanting to count the enslaved as a part of your population. However, you are not going to grant the enslaved legal rights, civil rights, or political rights. The enslaved are not allowed to earn any kind of income. The enslaved are not allowed to live on their own. In fact, you consider the enslaved property. You do not consider the enslaved human beings. So if you don't consider the enslaved a human being, how are you going to count them as a part of your population? Now, one of the things that you need to be mindful of is that the reason why they want to count the enslaved as a part of their population is so that they can increase the number of representatives they have. It's important that you write that down. The more representatives they have, the louder their collective voice is in the House of Representatives. That's why they want to count the enslaved as a part of their population. It's not because they consider the enslaved human beings. It's not because they suddenly value the presence of the enslaved. It's not because they consider the enslaved um, any more than animals? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The enslaved are just as devalued as they have always been. It is a matter of convenience. They count the enslaved as a part of their population simply for the fact that they need to have as many representatives as possible for their own political gain. This is about having um, the as much representation in the House of Representatives as possible. The other thing that I want to add here is this: if Southerners did not count the enslaved, and this is something that you should write down, if Southerners did not count the enslaved, Northern representatives easily outnumbered Southern representatives in the House. Easily. Uh, One of the things that you should keep in mind is that one third, that's 33% of the Southern population were enslaved peoples. 33%, one third of the Southern population at this time were enslaved. In fact, in South Carolina alone, in the state of South Carolina, 50% of their population were enslaved. So nearly half of their population were enslaved. So, of course, they're going to count their enslaved as a part of their population. They have to, because without them, Northerners are going to dominate the House of Representatives. Northerners will dominate the House of Representatives. And if Northerners dominate the House of Representatives, then the Northerners are going to dominate the legislative agenda. And if Northerners dominate the legislative agenda, well, then that's the end of any kind of Southern influence on any kind of congressional agenda, right? And Northerners make this argument, well, that's just too bad, so sad, right? Northerners make the argument, look, you count them as property, not people. Therefore, they're not a part of your population. This is our argument. You should count them as people. They should be citizens. And then maybe you can count them as a part of your census, a part of your population, and then you can get your representation. And of course, Southerners weren't willing to do that. And this becomes the next debate. This becomes the next point of contention. And that's what leads to the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise is proposed by James Wilson and Roger Sherman. And one of the things that you need to be mindful of is that this has just as much to do with representation as it has to do with taxes, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But what the compromise will result in is that each enslaved person would count as not a full human being, but as 3/5 of a person. Okay? 3/5 of a person and not a full human being. So each enslaved person, each Black person who was enslaved would count as 3/5 of a person, which would still give the South, which would still give Southern states more representatives, as well as, and again, this is very important, it would still give uh, the South more electoral votes for the presidency, and it would give them the advantage in the House of Representatives. I'm going to say all of that again, and I want you to be mindful of these things. It's going to give them more representatives, and it's going to give them more electoral votes in the Electoral College. And the reason why that's important is because this is going to have grave consequences for years to come. This means that when it comes to the South's influence on national politics and what that means for the entire country and for how long, it meant that slaveholding Southerners, and we're not talking a huge population here. We're not talking about like 50% of the South or 60% or even 30%. We're talking about 20% and not even that, maybe 15% of the South. 15% of Southerners held control of the entire country's political agenda until the 1850s. Until the 1850s, they stifled any national debate on the issue of slavery. You couldn't get anywhere on the issue of slavery, and it didn't matter that the topic of abolition, which was about abolishing slavery, it did not matter that it was gaining momentum, not just in the United States, but globally. It did not matter that more and more people were calling for the abolition of slavery. These men and women in the South, the 10 to 15% of them, had so much political power that none of those debates went anywhere because they had so much influence and control just in the House of Representatives. And one of the things that you need to consider is why that is going to matter so much, right? The fact that they were able to take that much power and control so early on because of this compromise. These enslaved individuals weren't even counted as full individuals. The fact that they were counted as three-fifths of a person each was enough to give them an advantage that lasted until the 1850s. Think of that power. And think of the power that it will have for generations to come. For generations to come. And the wealth that it will create for that small of a group. Furthermore, there is a real fear, and this is where the tax issue comes in. So Southerners have a real fear about the power of Congress as well, because Congress has the right. It's established early on that Congress would have the right to control trade. And with that, of course, is the fear that Congress would try to eliminate the international slave trade. Um, and so keep in mind that eventually international slave trade is going to start to slow down and eventually stop. But Congress, being Congress and having Northerners involved, Southerners feel that this is going to be a real issue. So the compromise is going to include the fact that um, a that a simple majority vote for all trade and commercial issues, um, if Congress agreed to eliminate the international slave trade until January 1808 and refrained from slapping a head tax on the enslaved peoples that were brought in. I'm going to say that again. The compromise agreed to a simple majority vote for Congress on all trade and commercial issues if Congress agreed not to eliminate the international slave trade until January 1808, and Congress promised to refrain from slapping a head tax on enslaved peoples. In other words, what they're saying is you've got to keep the international slave trade open until January 1808. So from now until January 1808, we have to be a part of the international slave trade. That's one condition. Number two, you are not going to put a tax on individual enslaved peoples coming into the United States. So we should be allowed to bring in as many enslaved peoples as possible, and you are not going to put in a tax on those individual peoples, no matter what. And as long as you agree to those things, then all you need to do to pass any kind of trade or commercial issue is a simple majority. They are willing to do anything and everything for slavery. That's the thing. Southerners are wanting to protect the institution of slavery and their stronghold on slavery. That's the key. They are so fearful that they will lose slavery. And the reason why is slavery is the key to their wealth. Now, I'm going to add this. Not everyone in the South owns slaves. Not every white person in the South owns slaves, because in order to own slaves, you have to have a tremendous amount of wealth. This is key. That's why I said earlier, only 10 to 15% of Southerners, if even that, at the highest point, only 10 to 15% of white Southerners own slaves. It's a very small percentage throughout the South. It's a very small percentage of white Southerners own slaves. But here's what I need you to understand. Money equals power, and power is a tremendous amount of influence. So a vast majority of white Southerners don't carry that kind of influence and don't carry that kind of power. However, they are going to be convinced eventually that someday they could have that power. Someday they could have that money. Someday they could have that influence. They can't. They won't. But that dream that they could have is enough to sustain them, right? And in fact, they are convinced that what stands in their way of gaining that influence, of gaining that power, of gaining that wealth is the black man, is the black woman. It's all a lie, but that's what they are convinced of. And who convinces them of that? These wealthy white Southerners. That's who convinces them. That's the irony. These wealthy white Southerners will convince poor white Southerners, you know who stands in your way of wealth? Oh, it's these poor black people. But the the irony is that it's the institution of slavery. The institution of slavery is what stands in the way of poor white Southerners really moving up the ladder. It's the institution of slavery that absolutely destroys the South and prevents the South from really evolving and becoming any kind of industrialized region, because wealthy white Southerners insist on holding on to this institution that keeps it from evolving and becoming better. And in the meantime, coming back to the topic at hand, what are the Northerners insisting on? What is it that the Northerners won't compromise on? Well, the Northerners say, okay, well, if you have that, the Northerners say, well, we will not have the word slavery mentioned in the Constitution. We draw the line there. That's that's their that's their big that's their big condition. We will not allow the word slavery to be included in the word Constitution. They believed that by not mentioning slavery by name, it would fail to give legal national recognition to the institution of slavery. I so there's that. As if not including the term would somehow not give some sort of validation to, or not give some sort of acknowledgement to its existence. Instead, the term that's included in the Constitution is, quote, other persons. The other persons, however, still means or still refers to the enslaved, right? So let's talk about the process of ratification, and this is going to be really complicated. So by September of 1787, the Constitution finally gets to its final draft, but there are three members of the convention who not only refused to sign, Three members refused to sign, and others actually had just walked out completely. And Virginia and New York refused to ratify the Constitution altogether. So I want to talk about how this actually unfolds. So when we talk about before I get to the criticisms of the Constitution, one of the things that I want to talk about here is how this unfolds. Um, so there are the three individuals who refused to sign. The first one is from Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, George Mason from Virginia, and Edmund Randolph from Virginia. Um, Gerry believed the executive office would create a king. George Mason opposed the Constitution because he says that it needed a Bill of Rights, and there was no Bill of Rights. And what he meant by a Bill of Rights, and there were others who agreed, was there needed to be a protected list of liberties um, for uh, for the people, and there wasn't any. And Edmund Randolph wasn't convinced that this was enough for the American people. Edmund Randolph would eventually come around to what was already here, but it would take a while. So, what I want you to understand from that is the Constitution, as it was not readily accepted. There was debate after debate after debate. This was not something that people readily agreed to. Now, when we talk about this process of ratification, only 9 of the 13 states were required to ratify it. Um, Delaware is the first to ratify. But when it comes to this ratification process, Virginia and New York refused to ratify it. Um, and the authors of the Constitution, specifically Madison, but it's not just going to be Madison. Madison wants it, Hamilton wants it, um, and there are others. They all agree that in order for the country to move forward, unified and into its new chapter, these two states, Virginia and New York, must ratify it for a couple of reasons. One, they are hugely populous states. Um, so that's incredibly important. But two, they are the leaders of their regions. New York is a leader of the North, Virginia is absolutely a leader of the South. If you don't have these two states leading the way for their regions, this is going to be a huge problem, and it's going to create a huge setback for the country. You need these two states to really lead the way for the nation. So, uh, when Virginia and New York refused to ratify, automatically we know that there's trouble on the horizon. And that leads to this debate about what the problem is for the Constitution. And of course, the most obvious criticism is the issue of slavery, right? The Constitution had effectively ignored this incredibly divisive subject because, I mean, they're not even going to mention it, right? This is going to be a huge, huge problem for plenty of Northerners. Many critics believed, at the very least, that, and this is important, that the Constitution should have a framework for how to end slavery. And many of the delegates, including George Washington, who himself was a slave owner, many of the delegates believed that there should at least have been something in the Constitution to include gradual emancipation. But something should have been, so this is not entirely a Northern proposal. There are slave owners themselves who know that this is going to be an issue that eventually divides the country. They know from the very beginning that this is going to be an issue that is going to cause long-term problems. And so something needs to be included in the Constitution that ends it, or it needed to be dealt with immediately, and nothing is done about it. The second criticism is that there are suggestions or arguments that the Constitution encroached on state power. James Madison, who is very big on the idea of state power, um, it's Madison's idea that Congress should have the power to veto state laws. Um, and that was, of course, not approved. From the very beginning, they were like, no, no, we should not, Congress should not be able to do that. There are still many people who believe that states were giving up way too many rights to the federal government, and this national government is way too centralized here, and states are giving up too much authority. We like the idea of states having their own authority, running their own business. There's too much authority given to the federal government. Uh, and then, of course, that comes back to George Mason's criticism, which was we need a Bill of Rights. There needs to be an individual list of rights um, that goes into the Constitution, um, because it needs to list individual liberties that guarantee what it is that Americans have protected by law, by the Constitution of the United States. There's also a fear that um, this Constitution would create an elite ruling class. One of the things that we have talked about in class is that this revolution is led by, and this Constitution is written by, a very specific group of men. And this group of men did not represent a cross section of society, right? These are not working class men. These are not men of color. You don't see any Native men involved in the conversation here, right? These are all very specific men. These are all men of wealth, men of influence, men of specific type of education. This is an elite group of men. Um, and so the critics who are saying that this is going to create an elite ruling class uh, are making the argument here that the Constitution safeguarded the rights of powerful men who had property. And not everyone at this time in the 1790s and or the 1780s and the 1790s owned property, because property is expensive. Most people don't own property. They work for someone who owns property. They work for someone who has a business. And if they have a business that's very small and barely making it, um, it would it would be a constitution that served their interests, but not necessarily the interests of the people. That's why it's important to have this individual list of rights, right? That would be why it's important to make sure that you had a Bill of Rights, to guarantee that you had a constitution that really served the best interests of all people. Um, the other criticism is that they don't like this idea of a strong executive branch. There is a very real fear that this executive branch uh, very closely resembled uh, a monarchy, that it looked way too closely like a king. And the counter argument to that was that the guys who wrote this Constitution, with Madison at the forefront, when uh, but especially with the help of Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton really likes the idea of a strong executive, and we'll get into that later on when we talk about the Federalist Papers. Um, these guys believed that in order for you to have an executive branch that is effective, then the president is going to have a a lot of power. You're going to have an executive branch with uh, a substantial amount of influence. But the critics argue that, listen, if you have somebody in the executive branch who is corrupt, then they're going to abuse that power, just like a monarch would. And then what are you going to do? And that's a fair criticism. So this criticism is quite possibly the biggest one of the biggest objections. And this should actually say, and I'll strike that out actually. This should actually say republicanism. So my apologies, not Republican, but republicanism. Um, Republicanism only worked for small countries. Republicanism only worked for small countries. Here's what I mean. Um, so their fear is that different interest groups would be competing with one another in order to have influence in the United States. Here's a good example of what's going on. So there's a worry that being a republic wasn't actually going to work. Being a republic works if you're a small country. Like, say, for example, Switzerland. Switzerland is a really small, mountainous European country. And it works because it's small. It's successful because it's small, and you can manage it as a representative republic because everybody is able to control how they operate and it's okay. But in a larger country like the United States, and keep in mind, this isn't even the full United States as we know it now, right? This is only the East Coast that's the United States. Not even Florida is included yet. And it's not even fully well populated yet. The fear is, listen, if you have a republic um, that is established here with this large of a population and this size in geography in terms of land mass, it's not going to work because having a representative republic in this way, you're going to have problems in terms of, people are going to be able to you're going to be able to bribe representatives, you're going to be able to bribe senators, and people are going to be corrupted, and it's going to get into the Congress, it's going to get into the presidency, and it's not going to be a true representation of the people. And the democracy or the republic will be corrupted. That's the fear. And so, no matter how pure your motivations are at the beginning, in the end, it's not going to matter. It's going to be destroyed. And so, how long is this really going to last? How long is this going to be effective? The last real criticism of the Constitution is that it did not include um, Native American nations into the framework of the national government. And this is a criticism that is looking into the long term, right? Because when you consider that um, these are people who are unavoidable, right? It's the same as the first criticism of slavery. Um, these are people who are going to be here long term. How are you going to deal with this question? It's the same thing as slavery in that this is not something you can avoid. Native peoples were here before, they're going to be here now, they're going to be here later. How are we going to deal with this issue? You can't avoid them. You have to deal with this issue now. So, how do we incorporate them into the framework of the nation? And it's something that should have been incorporated into the Constitution of the United States. Um, and it's something that should have been incorporated into the conversation. And the best way to have done that is by including them. But of course, that just wasn't even considered a part of the conversation. Um, Instead, what was considered was, well, how do we convince the people that this Constitution needs to be ratified? Um, and that was, of course, the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were essentially 85 articles written by three men: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Um, these 85 articles were published in newspapers across the country. And the purpose of these 85 articles were to persuade Americans to ratify the Constitution, um, most especially Virginia and New York, but really to get everybody behind the Constitution. Um, it's considered the country's greatest contribution to political thought. And by political thought, I mean global political thought. Um, of the 85 articles, Hamilton wrote 51, Madison wrote 26. John Jay would only write 5. He became ill during the process of writing, and he couldn't write any more than that. Hamilton and Madison actually collaborated on 3 of the articles. Um, and so when we talk about the papers themselves, um, there are a few that stand out that I do want to talk about, and then we'll move on. So, article number 10 was written by James Madison, and this is Madison defending the right of large republics to exist. The thing is remember, there's a criticism about large republics, and they say there's no way that a large republic can actually succeed. And he says, listen, the fear of various interest groups vying for power, that's there is a fear that there's going to be there's always going to be a competition for their influence, but it's really over exaggerated. You guys are taking that way um, out of control. Interest groups naturally cancel each other out, he says, because if you put a strong government in place, the structure of the strong government is enough to cancel out these interest groups. These interest groups are going to be there no matter what. But the idea is to have a strong enough government to essentially say that the government is stronger than the interest group. The government is stronger than the selfishness. The government is stronger than your selfish need to have influence and power. So, say, for example, that a foreign country is trying to manipulate its way into influencing our elections or try to take over our, systems of whatever. Madison's argument is they can try, but the structure that we establish in our Constitution should be strong enough to withstand it. Our structures that we establish within our individual departments, within our individual laws, are strong enough to withstand those things and hold people accountable. Um, and Federalist Paper number 51, this is also written by James Madison. He explains the separation of powers, and he establishes checks and balances and basically says this is built into the Constitution. And the reason why he explains that is because he says, listen, this is all designed to hold the people within government accountable. No one branch is more powerful than the other. And this is not just for the presidency, this is for Congress, and this is for the judiciary, the third branch of government, right? So the judiciary is designed to hold the executive and the legislative accountable, and the same goes for the other two. I mean, everybody holds each other in check, and to make sure that everybody is doing everybody else's job correctly. The last group of papers that I want to talk about are numbers 67 through 77, all written by Hamilton. And this is him defending the role of a strong executive. He basically says that you have to have a single voice um, that is strong and powerful, because sometimes you need that one voice in a time of crisis that is strong and dependable, right? That you can depend on to bring stability. And also, you need that single voice to keep Congress in check. You need that single voice that you can depend on to make sure that others are doing their job correctly. And for those people who believed that the presidency was too strong, he said, "Listen, the Constitution." He points to. He's going to repeat what Madison says. He points to the Constitution and says the Constitution provides for a check on the president's authority. And he says, you have a chance to impeach the president. If you think the president is acting out of control, there is a chance to impeach him and remove him from office. There is a process by which you can get him out. So it's not like this man is king and you have to wait for him to die. You can legally remove him from the office and replace him. So it's not like he's God and divinely appointed. He is there because the people put him there. But if he's out of control, remove him. So Hamilton says this is not a system where once he's there for life. Absolutely not. If he is acting above the law, then get him out of there. But in the meantime, let him be a strong leader and let him be someone who we can rely on in times of crisis, and he can be the at the forefront of our government. And what ends up happening is once the Federalist Papers are out there, it helps to push things forward towards ratification, right? The Federalist Papers are essential for the ratification process. But you know what else is essential? Uh, Madison puts pen to paper and pushes through the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights um, become the a part of the cornerstone of what we identify as Americans. But that'll be a part of our next unit.